Rain came down on Newport that afternoon like something with a grudge, striking the tall windows of the law office in sheets that blurred the harbor beyond into a smear of gray and green. Inside, the mahogany paneling drank up what little light the storm allowed, and the air smelled of lemon polish and old paper, of wet wool coats steaming faintly where they hung by the door. A brass lamp burned low on the desk between them, and beneath it lay a single sheet of paper that would, within the hour, become the subject of laughter sharp enough to leave a mark. She sat very still while the lawyer read the words aloud. The Boathouse and its contents, harborside, condemned by the town in 1998, and felt the room's attention swing toward her like a searchlight. Across the table, in a coat the color of money, the aunt let out a small, delighted sound, not quite a laugh, more the exhale of someone who has just watched a joke complete itself. One of the cousins actually clapped once, softly, mockingly, as though applauding a play badly performed. The other looked down at his phone. A boathouse, the aunt repeated, savoring it, turning the word over like something she might spit out. The one that's half in the water already. Well. She glanced at her daughter, then back, and her mouth curved into something that wanted to be called a smile. At least the tide will finally take it off our hands. Laughter moved around the table in a ripple, brittle and bright against the drumming rain, and she did not laugh with them. She only nodded once, the way she had nodded through 11 years of long nights and longer silences, through fevers and oxygen tanks, and a woman's hand gripping hers in the dark. Nodded the way people do who have learned that dignity, sometimes, is the only inheritance left to spend. Outside, the harbor churned gray and restless, gnawing at the pilings of the very boathouse now legally, uselessly, hers. No one in that warm, paneled room glanced toward the water. No one wondered why a woman who had spent decades building an empire of yachts and shingled rooms would leave her granddaughter nothing but a condemned shed sinking slowly into salt water. Nothing, that is, except what the tide had been patiently guarding for 60 years, waiting for someone with the sense to wade in and look. The rain did not let up. It came against the windows in long, insistent waves, as though something beneath the surface of that harbor were trying, in the only language it had, to knock. 3 weeks before that room, before the rain and the laughter, there had been a different gray, the flat, colorless gray of a Newport morning in early March, when the cemetery grass was still stiff with frost and the wind came off the water with a bite that seemed to have followed the mourners up from the harbor itself. She had stood at the edge of the plot in a borrowed black coat, watching the casket lowered into ground that had not yet properly thawed, and had thought, absurdly, that her grandmother would have complained about the digging. "You'll break your shovels on this frost, Henry," she used to say to the groundskeeper every year at her husband's grave, scolding him with the particular tenderness of a woman who loved by finding fault. 11 years. That was how long she had measured her life in the small increments of another person's failing body, in medication schedules taped to the refrigerator, in the particular hiss of an oxygen concentrator at 3 a.m., in learning to read pain in the set of a jaw before a single word was spoken. She had given up a college transfer, 2 different men who grew tired of waiting, an apartment of her own. She had not thought of it as sacrifice at the time. It had simply been the next necessary thing, the way tightening a stay or recalking a seam was the next necessary thing on a boat that wanted, badly, to keep floating. Her aunt had come to the cemetery in a camel coat that cost more than a semester of the tuition Clara never finished, and had stood exactly as long as decency required, 20 minutes, perhaps 25, dabbing at dry eyes with a folded handkerchief before murmuring something about the caterer and slipping back toward a waiting car. The cousins had arrived together, fashionably late, exchanging low words about a sailing regatta they'd nearly missed for this, and departed just as promptly, their heels clicking across frozen ground like something counting down. Clara had stayed until the last shovelful. She had stayed because for 11 years she had been the one who stayed, through the fevers, through the terrible quiet stretches when her grandmother forgot her name and then, hours later, gripped her wrist and said it perfectly clear, as if surfacing from deep water to say it. Clara. Just that, as though the word itself were a kind of anchor thrown between them. She had not known, standing there with frost cracking faintly under her boots and the harbor visible as a gray seam beyond the headstones, that her grandmother had spent those same 11 years, between the fevers, between the silences, writing something else entirely. Something folded small and sealed tight, waiting, not in a lawyer's file, but in the dark, tide-washed belly of an old wooden boat, for hands patient enough to find it. The house had run on a schedule only she kept, written in pencil on the inside of a kitchen cabinet door where no visitor would think to look. 7 o'clock, the white pills with breakfast. Noon, the blue capsule with a full glass of water, never juice. The doctor had been firm about that. 9 at night, the liniment rubbed slow into the knotted shoulders that had once hauled sailcloth and now could barely lift a spoon. She had learned to read her grandmother's silences the way her grandfather had once taught her to read a coming squall, a certain stillness in the air, a certain color behind the eyes, and to move before the pain became visible. The house smelled always of two things layered one over the other, the sharp camphor sting of liniment, and beneath it, fainter, the salt the old woman's cardigans had never quite let go of, decades of harbor air worked into the wool. Nights were the long country of the work. She learned to sleep in fragments, an hour here, 40 minutes there, waking at the sound of a cough through the wall, at the particular creak of the bed when her grandmother tried, stubbornly, to rise without her. She learned to warm broth without a clatter of pots, to read aloud from old sailing logs when the pain was bad and words were the only medicine left, her grandmother's hand finding hers in the dark and gripping with a strength that never matched the frailty of the rest of her. Elsewhere, the cousins were building other kinds of lives, glossy and distant as photographs in a bank's annual report. One had made partner at a Boston firm the same autumn the diagnosis came, a fact relayed by phone in a voice already half elsewhere. The other worked in private equity in New York, sending, twice a year, an enormous bouquet with a card signed in a hand that was clearly not his own. They visited for holidays, for an hour, sometimes 2, admiring the view from the sun porch, remarking on how well she looked. She never looked well, not once in 11 years, before driving back to lives that did not smell of camphor, that did not know the sound a body makes at 3 in the morning when it is afraid and trying not to show it. Clara did not resent them, not then. She simply stopped expecting them at the door. She learned instead to find her company in smaller things, the tide chart pinned above the stove, the foghorn's low complaint at dawn, her grandmother's voice, when it was strong enough, telling old stories of the harbor and the boathouse, and a boy who had once loved her enough to build her a skiff with his own 2 hands. Clara listened to those stories the way she measured medicine, carefully, completely, storing each one against a future she did not yet know she would need it for. The last of those stories came on a Tuesday in February, though she would not have called it a story so much as a fragment, spoken in the thinned voice that had, by then, replaced the one she'd grown up with. The room had smelled of eucalyptus, and the particular staleness of a window kept shut too long against the cold. Outside, the harbor was the color of pewter, and the wind worried at the shutters like something trying to be let in. Her grandmother's hand, when it found hers, had almost no weight to it at all. 11 years of measuring doses and adjusting pillows had taught her the exact pressure a failing body could exert, and this was less than that, a suggestion of grip rather than a grip itself. But the eyes were clear. That was what she would remember afterward, turning the moment over the way she turned a plank before deciding whether it could be saved. The eyes were clear and urgent, in a way the voice could no longer be. "The skiff," she'd said. "Promise me the skiff is never sold." Clara had assumed, in the moment, that this was simply what remained when a mind began to loosen its hold on the present. Old attachments surfacing out of order, sentiment mistaking itself for instruction, She had said yes, of course, the easy yes one gives to the dying, the yes that costs nothing and means everything to the person asking it. Her grandmother had held her eyes a moment longer, as though testing the weight of the promise the way Clara herself might test a joint for rot, and then the grip had loosened, and the moment had passed into the general blur of that final month. The medications, the hushed calls to hospice, the aunt's brief visits that always seemed time to avoid anything unpleasant. She had not thought of it again until she stood in the boathouse loft, weeks after the funeral, looking down through a gap in the floorboards at the skiff resting in its cradle below, its hull silvered with dust and salt rime, its lines still elegant beneath decades of neglect. It should have meant nothing more than any of her grandmother's other small, tender instructions. Keep the roses cut back, don't let the fire go out, save the good teacups for someone who'll use them. But it did not sit that way in her memory. It sat the way certain diagnoses had sat, in the years of nursing, not alarming on their own, but wrong in some way she could not yet name, a symptom without a cause. She had filed it away then, as she filed away everything she did not understand but could not dismiss, the way she'd once logged an odd reading on a blood pressure cuff to mention to the doctor later. Not urgent, not yet explained, only waiting, patient as the tide, for the day it would matter. The office had smelled of rain and lemon oil, that particular Newport combination of old wood, polished too often, and weather that never quite left the coastline alone. 3 weeks before, she stood in that dusty loft. Clara had sat in a low leather chair against the wall, hands folded in her lap, watching water run down the tall windows in ropes. The mahogany paneling drank what little light came through, so that the room seemed lit less by the gray afternoon than by the brass lamp on the lawyer's desk, its green shade throwing a small, steady circle over the folio in front of him. The lawyer was a heavy-set man in his 70s, silver-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who had read too many wills to be moved by any of them anymore, though something in his eyes, when they passed over Clara, suggested this one cost him more than most. He had known the family 40 years. He had drafted 3 prior versions of this document. He opened the leather folder slowly, as though giving the room time to settle, and cleared his throat. "We are gathered," he began, in the flat cadence particular to such rooms, for the reading of the last will and testament of the deceased, dated the 11th of January of this year, superseding all prior instruments. The aunt sat with her ankles crossed, a black wool coat over her shoulders, though the room was warm, her younger son beside her checking his phone beneath the table, the elder son upright and attentive in the manner of a man who has rehearsed, looking humble. Clara noticed how none of them looked at her. She had grown used to that particular kind of not looking, the kind that requires effort. The lawyer read on, unhurried, the language thick with whereas and thereto, item by item, the shingled house on Ocean Avenue, its furnishings, its silver, the sloop and the larger yacht, moored at the yacht club since spring, the trust established in 1978, its accounts, its disbursement schedule. Each clause landed like a small, dry stone dropped into still water, and Clara watched the aunt's shoulders ease with each one, saw the flicker of arithmetic behind her eyes. Clara herself sat very still. She had nursed her grandmother through 4 hospitalizations, through the slow unwinding of a mind that had once run a household like a ship's log, precise and unforgiving. She had expected nothing, and told herself as much on the drive over, the wipers beating time against the glass. But there is a difference between expecting nothing and hearing it confirmed aloud, clause by clause, in a stranger's measured voice, while rain kept its own relentless accounting against the windows behind her. The lawyer turned a page. His eyes moved down the paragraph, then, briefly, up to Clara, the first time all afternoon. "There remains one final bequest," he said. He paused there, as though giving the room a moment to settle, though the room did not need it. The aunt had already folded her hands in her lap in the posture of a woman accustomed to good news arriving on schedule. One cousin, the older one, the lawyer, sharp-suited even on a Tuesday afternoon in the rain, leaned back with the faint, satisfied air of a man confirming a verdict he had already written himself. The younger cousin, the one who managed money for other people's money, had taken out his phone beneath the table and was, Clara suspected, already composing a text to someone about slip fees and insurance transfers for the yacht that was now, on paper, his. None of them had asked a single question about the house on Ocean Avenue, the silver, the trust. They had not needed to. They had known the shape of it for years, the way children know the shape of a room they grew up in, even in the dark, knew it in the offhand way people know things they were always going to receive, the way Clara had known, without ever being told outright, that the 11 years belonged to her, because someone had to give them, and no one else would. The residence at 40 Ocean Avenue, the lawyer continued, together with its contents, to be divided as specified in Schedule C between the parties named therein. He read the names. The aunt did not blink. The vessels. Whitfield's Pride and Marguerite, currently moored at the Ida Lewis Yacht Club to pass in equal share. A pause, procedural, nothing more. And the trust established the 14th of June, 1978, its principal and any accrued interest, to be distributed per the schedule attached hereto. The aunt exhaled, not visibly, but Clara, who had spent 11 years learning to read the smallest movements of a body trying not to show what it felt, saw it in the loosening of her jaw, the way her rings caught the light as her hand relaxed on the arm of the chair. It was the exhale of a woman confirming that the world had, in fact, behaved as it was supposed to. Well, the aunt said, to no one in particular, though the word carried, as her words always did, exactly as far as she intended it to. Mother always did believe in doing things properly. The younger cousin allowed himself a small, private smile at his phone. The older one glanced once toward Clara, not unkindly exactly, but with the mild curiosity of a man checking whether a minor line item had been accounted for, and then looked away again, satisfied that whatever it was, it would not concern him. Rain went on hammering the tall windows behind the lawyer's desk, streaking the old glass in long, unbroken lines, and somewhere beneath the practiced calm of the room, Clara felt something settle low and cold in her chest, a stillness that was not yet grief and not yet anger, only the sensation of watching a door close from the wrong side of it. The lawyer set down one page and lifted another. He cleared his throat with the particular delicacy of a man about to say something no one in the room would enjoy hearing, though only one person would feel it. To my granddaughter, he read, and paused, the way he had paused before each name, giving it the same formal weight regardless of what followed. Clara Elizabeth Whitfield, I bequeath the property known as the Whitfield Boathouse, situated at the foot of Harbor Lane, together with all structures, fixtures, and vessels contained therein, and the deed thereto in full. A silence took the room, but it was not the silence that had followed the reading of the mansion, or the yachts, or the trust. It was a thinner silence, the kind that comes before someone decides whether to laugh. The lawyer did not look up. He had read enough wills in that office to know the shape of the sentence that was coming, and perhaps some old loyalty to the woman who had signed this one kept his eyes fixed on the page a moment longer than necessary. That's it? The older cousin said, not cruelly, but with the flat surprise of a man reviewing a ledger that did not balance. The boathouse, the one that's... He stopped, glancing at his mother as though for the correct word. Condemned, the aunt supplied, and there was something almost pleasant in the way she said it, the ease of a woman, confirming a fact she had long suspected, and was relieved, finally, to have proven. She turned in her chair, just enough to face Clara directly for the first time since the reading began, and Clara would remember, long after, the particular composure of that turn, unhurried, certain, the posture of someone who had never once doubted how this would end. The tide comes up through the floorboards at high water, doesn't it? Half the roof's gone. The harbor authority's been trying to make someone tear it down for years. She smiled then, Not widely, just enough to let it reach her eyes. Well, at least the tide will take it off our hands. The younger cousin laughed first, a short, surprised bark of a sound, quickly muffled behind his hand, and then the older one followed, more quietly, more out of relief than genuine amusement, the laugh of a man glad the tension had broken in a direction that cost him nothing. The aunt did not laugh. She simply watched Clara with the calm satisfaction of a woman who had said the correct thing at the correct moment, and who expected, not unreasonably, to be admired for it. Rain kept coming against the windows. The lawyer set the page down and did not reach for another right away, and in that small pause Clara understood that he, at least, had expected her to say something, to protest, to weep, to ask why, and that her silence was, in its own way, disappointing him too. She said nothing. She folded her hands in her lap, the way she had folded them beside a hospital bed for 11 winters, and waited for the meeting to end. The meeting ended the way most legal meetings end, with signatures and murmured thanks and the soft closing of a leather folder, and none of it took more than 10 minutes, though to her it felt like the longest 10 minutes of the 11 years combined. Outside, the rain had not eased. It came down the same steady, indifferent way it had come down all morning, running in dark ropes off the awning of the law office and pooling against the curb where the town car idled, its driver reading a newspaper folded into a small, damp square. She stood under the awning with the deed in a manila envelope, not yet opened, and watched the family arrange themselves into their cars with the practiced ease of people who had never once had to think about where they would sleep. The aunt paused by the door of the sedan long enough to say, not unkindly, in the voice of someone offering a small courtesy, "You'll let us know if you need help finding a room somewhere, won't you?" It was not a question. She did not wait for an answer. By evening, she understood the shape of what had actually happened. There would be no more envelope of cash on the first of the month, the quiet arrangement her grandmother had insisted on years ago, and the family had grudgingly honored out of appearances more than gratitude. There would be no more room in the mansion's east wing, the one she had slept in for 11 winters with the baby monitor turned always to its highest volume. There would be, she came to understand over the following days, no more invitations at all. Not to the cousin's engagement dinner 3 weeks out, not to the small memorial gathering the aunt organized at the yacht club, a gathering Clara learned of only because a caterer's van blocked her street for an afternoon. She was not surprised. She had spent enough years watching the family's affections move like weather, arriving and departing according to convenience, to know that her usefulness had expired with her grandmother's pulse. What surprised her, faintly, was how quickly the space closed over where she had been, the way water closes over a dropped stone, smooth and untroubled within a day. Her apartment lease came up for renewal on the 9th of April, and she did not renew it. The arithmetic was simple enough to do standing at the kitchen counter with a calculator and a stack of bills. No income, $400 in savings, and one asset in the world, a rotting boathouse the county had already condemned twice. She drove out to the harbor on a gray Tuesday with her belongings in the back of her car and stood a long while at the door before she found, tucked behind a warped shutter, a set of keys her grandfather had hidden there decades before, keys that still, impossibly, turned. The loft above the boat bay was dry, at least. That would have to be enough for now. The roof leaked in 4 places, and she found each of them the hard way, waking to the particular cold shock of water finding a collarbone at 3 in the morning. She spent her first week's grocery money on a bundle of asphalt shingles and a caulking gun instead, climbing out onto the pitch of the boathouse roof in a borrowed harness she was fairly sure would not hold if tested, and worked until her fingers went numb around the hammer. She had watched her grandfather patch this same roof once, 20 years before, and found she remembered the rhythm of it in her hands before she remembered it in her mind. Overlap, nail, seal, overlap again, the body keeping what the mind had let go soft. There was no running water in the loft yet, only a hose bib at the base of the dock that groaned when she turned it and produced water so cold it made her gasp on contact. She hauled it in a 5-gallon bucket up the narrow stairs each morning, twice for washing, twice more for the kettle, and learned to ration it the way she had once rationed her grandmother's morphine, in careful, measured amounts against an uncertain future. She took what work she could find: a rotted porch rail in Middletown, a cracked oar handle for a man who paid her in cash, and a sack of clams, a set of kitchen cabinets that needed rehanging for a widow who fed her lunch and did not ask why her hands were so raw. None of it paid well. All of it kept the lights, such as they were, technically on. The isolation had a texture to it she had not expected, a kind of cold that was not only weather. She noticed how the harbor emptied of people by 4 in the afternoon this time of year, how the gulls became the only conversation available to her, how she had begun, without deciding to, talking to the skiff while she worked on it, narrating her own hands to herself, the way a nurse narrates a patient's vitals to keep her attention sharp. Across the water, some nights, she could see the mansion's windows lit gold and full, the caterer's van long gone, replaced now by a contractor's truck putting in new dock lighting, the glow of it laid down across the harbor in a long, trembling line that reached almost to her door and then dissolved before it arrived. She watched it some evenings, the way one watches a fire from outside in the cold, not with longing exactly, but with the strange, steadying comfort of having a fixed point to measure her own darkness against. She did not write to her aunt. She did not call her cousins. She patched the roof, hauled the water, and in the evenings, by lantern light, she began, slowly, with a borrowed set of chisels, to open the hull of the skiff. The skiff had been her grandfather's before it was anyone's problem, before it became a shape under a tarp that the aunt's men had once suggested, in an offhand way, should simply be hauled to the dump along with the rest of the boathouse's contents. 16 feet of lapstrake cedar, its transom stamped faintly with a builder's mark from a Bristol yard that had not existed in 40 years, it had sat cradled in the boathouse's lower bay through every season of her grandmother's illness, forgotten by everyone except, apparently, the water, which had found its way in through the seams and settled into the bilge like something patient and unhurried. She had not planned to touch it. She had told herself, that first week in the loft, that she would leave it exactly where it lay, another ruined thing among ruined things, proof only of how thoroughly the tide could undo what a man had once built with his hands. But there is a particular sound rotten wood makes under a chisel, not a crack, more a sigh, a long soft exhalation of fiber giving way, and the first time she heard it, testing a single plank near the bow, more out of curiosity than intention, something in her chest answered it. She remembered, then, the smell of the boathouse in summers she had almost let herself forget. Linseed oil and cedar shavings. Her grandfather's voice, low and unhurried, explaining how a plank must be coaxed rather than forced, how you could feel with your palm where the grain wanted to bend and where it would only break. She remembered being 9, 10, sanding until her arms ached, proud beyond reason of a single smooth curve of hull achieved without splitting the wood. So she began, not with any plan for what the boat would become, or whether it would ever touch water again, but because the alternative, to leave it exactly as she had found it, sagging and gray and given up on, felt like a second death she was not willing to permit. She worked the rot back plank by plank, marking each one in pencil before she cut, keeping the good wood and setting the ruined pieces aside in a growing pile by the door, the way her grandfather had taught her to sort a catch, keep her from throwback, without sentiment but also without waste. Some nights she got no farther than a single foot of hull before her hands gave out and she sat back on the cold concrete, listening to the gulls settle and the harbor go dark by degrees. It was slow work and lonely work, and there were evenings she was certain it was foolish work, a woman alone patching a dead man's boat in a condemned building nobody wanted. But her hands kept finding the rhythm of it anyway, chisel and mallet, and somewhere beneath the third plank from the keel, without her yet knowing it, something waited that was not rot at all. She began keeping a notebook, an old marbled composition book she had bought for 89 cents at the drugstore on Thames Street, because her grandfather had always said that a boat kept no secrets from a person who wrote things down. On the first page, she drew the skiff in profile, a crude thing of straight lines, and beneath it she began her list, dated the way her grandmother had taught her to date everything. The full month spelled out, the year in full, no abbreviations, as if brevity were a kind of disrespect to the record. Cracked ribs, she wrote, third and fourth from bow, likely sprung in a hard grounding, not rot. Transom soft through, water damage of long standing, replace entire. She noted the centerboard trunk, swollen and split along its seam. She noted, without much interest at first, that the garboard plank ran a half-inch proud of where the lines suggested it should sit, a small imperfection she attributed to 50 years of swelling and drying, the wood breathing in its slow wooden way through half a century of Newport winters. It was the keel that kept pulling her attention back, the way a loose tooth pulls the tongue. She had restored enough small craft with her grandfather to know the ordinary weight of a keel on a boat this size, a day sailor, 16 feet, built for calm water and light air, not for punishing seas that demanded ballast. This one was heavier, not dramatically so, not enough that a casual hand would notice, but her hands were not casual, and when she hefted the aft section during the plank replacement, she felt a density in it that did not match the class, did not match the era, did not match anything she had handled before. She wrote it down anyway, the way she wrote down everything, without yet attaching meaning to it. Keel bolted unusually thick for a boat of this design. Possible later modification? Query. She underlined query twice, out of habit rather than urgency, and went back to the ribs. The days had a rhythm now, wave-like, the way the tide itself moved. A burst of steady progress followed by a slack hour where she sat on an overturned bucket with a cup of instant coffee going cold in her hands, watching rain freckle the gray water beyond the doorway, and then another burst, sanding, sistering, gluing, as if the work itself breathed in and out. She did not think of the keel again for 3 days. She was occupied with the transom, with steaming a new piece of white oak into a curve that matched the old lines almost exactly, and it was only when she knelt to refit the centerboard trunk, running her palm flat along the keel's underside to check its trueness, that her fingers found the seam. It was not a crack. Cracks in old wood had a certain honesty to them, jagged and unashamed. This was a line too straight, too deliberate, filled long ago with something that had darkened to match the surrounding grain but had not quite disappeared. She sat back on her heels and stared at it for a long time before she reached for the chisel. She set the chisel down without using it, not yet. Some things she had learned long ago were not meant to be rushed into. A lesson that had nothing to do with wood and everything to do with the man who had taught her to read it. She let the week close around the seam instead, the way the tide closes over a stone. There were ribs to steam, 7 of them, each one a strip of white oak she had ripped herself on the loft's old bandsaw, and she fed them one by one into the steam box she had built from scrap plywood and a wallpaper steamer bought secondhand for $11. 20 minutes a rib. She timed it on her phone, though she hardly needed to. She could feel when the wood had gone soft enough to bend, the way it seemed to sigh into her hands. "You'll know when it's ready," he used to say, crouched beside her on the dock when she was 9, no older, his knuckles swollen even then with the arthritis that would later steal his grip entirely. Wood tells you things if you stop talking over it. She had not understood him then. She understood him now, sanding until her fingertips lost their prints, the dust settling into the creases of her knuckles, exactly as it must have settled into his. The rain did not stop that week so much as change its register, sometimes a hiss on the tin roof, sometimes a patient tapping, once a long silence that turned out to be fog instead, pressing white and close against the doorway, so that the harbor disappeared entirely, and the boathouse became its own small country. She ate crackers standing at the workbench. She slept, when she slept, in the loft under 3 blankets that smelled of cedar and mildew in equal measure, and she dreamed, more than once, of small hands guiding hers around a spokeshave, of a voice saying, "Let the tool find the grain. Don't fight it. Don't ever fight it." By Thursday, the new ribs sat clamped and drying against the hull's old curve, a faint mismatch of pale wood against the ship's biscuit brown of everything original, like new teeth in an old mouth. She ran her hand along the seam of them, satisfied in a way she had not expected, a satisfaction that did not care whether anyone else would ever see this boat afloat again. It was Friday morning, gray and windless, when she came back to the centerboard trunk with fresh eyes and the chisel she had set aside. She knelt. She found the line again exactly where she had left it, unhealed, patient, waiting, the way old wood waits, without impatience, without expectation, the way her grandmother had waited 11 years for a granddaughter to notice what none of the others had bothered to see. She pressed her thumbnail into the seam. It gave. It gave the way old things give, not with drama, but with a small, exhausted sigh, as if the wood had been holding its breath since before she was born. A curl of something dark flaked away under her thumbnail, brittle and black, and for a moment she thought it was simply rot, the same rot she had been carving out of this hull for 11 days. But rot did not sit in a straight line. Rot did not have edges. She set the chisel down and used her fingers instead, the way her grandfather had taught her to feel for a seam before ever cutting one. Let your hands see it first. The eyes lie, the hands don't. And beneath the centerboard trunk, tucked into a hollow no wider than a bread loaf, she found tar, old tar, gone hard and glassy as coal, packed in tight and pressed into the tar, holding it the way straw holds mud in an old wall, a mat of coarse, dark horsehair. She sat back on her heels. No boat builder packed a seam like this. Not here, not below the trunk, not in a place no inspector would ever think to look and no water would ever reach. This was not caulking. This was concealment. It took her the better part of an hour, working with the smallest of her grandfather's gouges and a patience that had nothing to do with boats, to clear it away without splitting the surrounding wood. The same patience she had once spent unwrapping gauze from a wrist too swollen to touch. The same patience that had never once been thanked. The tar came away in stubborn black curls. The horsehair came away in fistfuls, dry and warm-smelling despite the cold of the loft, like something out of a horse blanket 40 years gone. And then her fingers touched metal, not the bronze of a fitting, not the dull gray of a fastening bolt. Brass, unmistakably brass, though age had crept over it in blooms of green-black patina, and beneath the patina, when she rubbed it with her thumb, a stubborn gleam that no amount of harbor damp had managed to kill entirely. A tube, sealed at both ends, no longer than her forearm, wedged into the hollow beneath the keel, with the same deliberate care as a stone set into a ring. She did not pull it free at once. She knelt there instead, in the gray Friday light, with her hand resting on the cold curve of it, feeling, absurdly she would think later, though it did not feel absurd in the moment, as though she had interrupted something, as though she had walked into a room mid-sentence. Let the tool find the grain. The voice in her dream had said. Don't fight it. She did not fight it. She only knelt there a moment longer, breathing in cedar and mildew and old tar, before she finally closed both hands around the tube and began, carefully, to work it loose. The tube came free with a sound like a held breath finally released, a soft suck of air, decades old, escaping the space where it had rested. She did not open it there, kneeling in the hull with her knees aching against the ribs of the boat. She carried it up to the loft instead, holding it the way she imagined one might hold something recently alive, and set it on the plank table beneath the single hanging bulb, and for a long moment she only looked at it. Outside, the harbor had gone fully dark, and the wind moved through the loose shingles with a low, patient rattle. She made tea she did not drink. She lit the kerosene lamp beside the bulb, an old habit from years of losing power in her grandmother's house, and in that doubled light, electric and flame, she finally turned her attention to the cap. Wax sealed the seam, cracked in places by age, and she worked it loose with the flat edge of a palette knife, the same patience she gave to old varnish, unwilling to force what time had already loosened on its own. The cap resisted, then gave, turning with a dry shriek of metal that seemed enormous in the quiet loft. Inside, rolled tight, was paper, old paper, gone the color of weak tea, brittle enough that she held her own breath as she eased it out. She unrolled it across the table, weighting the corners with a hammer, a jar, her own two hands, and found herself looking down at lines drawn in faded India ink, a shoreline, a harbor mouth, a parcel boundary marked in a careful, surveyor's hand, dated in the corner in small numerals, 1962. Beneath the survey lay a folded letter, and she knew the handwriting before she had even finished unfolding it. She had seen it on birthday cards, on grocery lists, on the backs of photographs for 11 years. Her grandmother's hand, though younger here, less shaken, the loops still generous and sure. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed the fold flat. The paper trembled with them, faintly, in the lamp's uneven light. She read the first line, then stopped, and made herself breathe before reading it again, as though speed might cause the words to slip from the page before she could hold them. She did not yet understand all of it, not the surveyor's notations, not the boundary markers, not why her grandmother had sealed this in brass and buried it beneath the keel of a boat rather than in a drawer, a safe, a lawyer's file. But she understood enough to feel the floor of the loft tilt slightly beneath her, the way a deck tilts under a shifting wind. She sat back slowly in the hard chair, the lamp hissing softly beside her, the letter held loosely now in both hands, and outside the tide moved against the pilings in the dark, patient and unbothered, as it had moved for longer than any of them had been alive. She began again, more slowly this time, tracing each line with the tip of her finger, as though touch might steady the meaning the way it steadied the paper. The date at the top was written in the same careful hand as the rest, a winter, decades before Clara was born, when her grandmother had been a young wife with a new surname and an old worry she had apparently confided to no one. I have gone back through Father's papers 3 times now. The letter read, "And I cannot make the numbers agree. The parcel he left us was never meant to be cut the way it was cut. I do not think my brothers understood what they signed. I do not think, God forgive me, that they were meant to." Clara read the sentence twice, then a third time. Her grandmother, young, uncertain, writing alone at some kitchen table 40 years before Clara had ever held her hand through a hospital railing, had suspected the division of the family land was wrong from the very beginning. Not sensed it vaguely, the way one senses an unfairness and lets it pass. Suspected it specifically, with the patience of someone who had gone back through papers 3 times. The letter went on, the handwriting tightening slightly, as if the writer had paused to collect herself before continuing. "I have said nothing to them. There would be no use in it now, and I do not wish to be the sister who spoiled Christmas with a lawyer's letter, but I could not, in good conscience, sign what they signed. My deed remains as Father recorded it, the whole of it, water and all. I have kept it separate. I have kept it whole." Clara set the page down on her knee, very carefully, the way she might set down something newly glued and not yet dry. Outside, a gull cried once over the black water and went silent. "I have kept it whole." She thought of the mansion 200 yards up the shore, its shingles freshly painted every 3rd spring, its dock lights burning gold against the evening fog. She thought of her aunt's voice in the mahogany office, bright and dismissive. "At least the tide will take it off our hands." And felt something cold settle low in her chest, not triumph, not yet, only the beginning of a question she did not know how to finish asking. If her grandmother alone had kept her portion of the land intact, unsubdivided, uncorrected by whatever paperwork had passed between siblings in some other winter decades ago. Then what, exactly, had her aunt and cousins actually inherited? And what had they built their lives upon all these years without ever thinking to ask? Clara turned the page over, searching for more, but the ink stopped there, mid-thought, as though her grandmother had been interrupted, or had simply decided, for the moment, that she had said enough. She did not sleep well that night, nor the one after. She lay in the loft with the tarp ceiling breathing above her in the wind, and she found herself arguing with the dark the way she used to argue, silently, with the doctors who spoke of her grandmother's prognosis in numbers instead of days. A survey and a letter were not proof. They were the private grievance of an old woman near the end of her life, perhaps confused, perhaps only wounded by some family betrayal so old it had calcified into myth. She had seen illness do strange things to memory near the close of it, sharpen some parts unbearably, corrode others past recognition. She did not want to build a case on the resentments of a dying woman. She had spent 11 years learning the difference between what her grandmother needed and what her grandmother, in pain, only wanted to say. But there was the ink. There was the careful, unhurried hand, nothing like the loosening scrawl of the last hospital months, when even a signature had cost her something. This had been written earlier, deliberately, by someone still strong enough to hide a brass tube beneath the keel of a boat she trusted her granddaughter alone to one day restore. That Clara kept returning to, not the accusation, the care of it. She thought of driving straight to the mahogany office, laying the survey across the lawyer's desk, and asking him to explain, in his weary and precise way, what it meant. She thought of confronting her aunt on the mansion's freshly painted porch, letter in hand, and watching her face change. Both thoughts came to her easily, and both times she set them aside, the way she'd once set aside the urge to argue with a nurse who was, in the end, only doing her job badly out of exhaustion. Accusation without proof was just another kind of noise, and she had spent too many years learning patience to abandon it now, for the satisfaction of a single afternoon. So she did what she knew how to do. She cleaned the survey's fold lines with a soft brush, photographed each page in the flat gray light of morning, and began, the following Monday, to make a list: Harbor Authority, Land Registry, the Historical Society 2 towns over, whatever office kept the ledgers old enough to remember 1962. She did not tell her aunt. She did not tell her cousins. She told no one at all, in fact, except the skiff, half-stripped and patient in its cradle, and the letter itself, which she returned, each night, to its tube, as though tucking in something that had waited long enough to be believed. The Newport Historical Society occupied the ground floor of an old customs building near the wharf, its reading room smelling of dust and radiator heat, and the woman at the desk, gray-haired, patient in the way of someone who had spent decades among other people's forgotten paper, did not ask why she wanted the 1961 Harbor Authority maps. She only asked whether she needed gloves. She did. The maps came out flat and enormous, rolled in acid-free tissue, and she spread the first across the long oak table with the same care she had once used to turn her grandmother in bed, slow, deliberate, mindful of what might tear. The paper was cool under her palms. Someone, decades ago, had drawn these boundary lines with a steel nib and a steadier hand than her own, and she found herself grateful for that steadiness now, because it meant the lines could be trusted. She laid her grandmother's survey beside it. For a long while she did nothing but look. The two documents agreed on almost everything: the curve of the shoreline, the depth soundings, the old stone marker at the harbor's eastern edge, which was itself a kind of proof, the sameness of true things. But where the 1962 survey showed a single unbroken parcel running from the boathouse north along the water to a boundary stake near what was now the mansion's dock, the Harbor Authority's later filings showed 3 parcels, cleanly divided, dated 11 months apart from one another. The division had happened fast. Too fast, she thought, for anything but paperwork already decided before the ink dried. She copied the parcel numbers into her notebook in the small, patient handwriting her grandmother had taught her, the same hand she'd used for medication schedules and doctors' names. She had learned long ago that precision was its own kind of love. The woman at the desk brought her a second box without being asked. Assessor's records, she said, sometimes filed separately from the harbor maps, and inside it Clara found a subdivision application bearing her grandmother's name, dated 1963, and beneath it, in different ink, a signature that did not match the one she had spent 11 years watching her grandmother sign on prescription forms and holiday cards alike. She sat very still with that page for a long time. Outside, gulls worked the low tide, and somewhere down the block a delivery truck idled, ordinary sounds from an ordinary Tuesday, and she was grateful for them, because they kept her from feeling the ground shift as much as it wanted to. She photographed the page twice, once with the flash and once without, the way she'd learned to document a wound she didn't yet understand the size of. Then she closed the box gently, thanked the woman at the desk, and stepped out into the gray afternoon with the beginnings of a list longer than the one she'd started with. County registry, notary records, whoever had witnessed a signature that wasn't the one it claimed to be. The county registry occupied the basement of a building that had once been a customs house, and the woman there, younger, brisker, less patient with silence, pulled the notary logs for 1963 without being told twice what year mattered. She found the entry in under 10 minutes, a notarization fee paid in cash, a witness signature belonging to a name Clara did not recognize, and a notary seal registered to a man who had died, according to the State Bar's own historical roster, in November of 1961. She read that date 3 times before it settled. A dead man had notarized a signature that did not belong to the woman it claimed to represent, 14 months after his own funeral. She did not say anything aloud. She wrote it down instead, the way she had learned to write down a fever or a dosage, because numbers held their shape on paper in a way that feelings did not. The clerk asked if she needed a copy, and Clara said yes, please, both sides, and stood at the counter listening to the machine warm and hum, and spit out pages that felt, in her hand, heavier than their weight. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist that clung to the wrought iron fence and the dark hulls of the moored boats beyond it, and she stood a long moment beneath the eave, not moving toward the truck, because she understood, with a clarity that felt almost unwelcome, what she was now holding. Not a discrepancy, not an old family embarrassment to be quietly folded back into a drawer, a forgery, dressed in enough decades to look like history, but a forgery all the same, sitting at the root of everything her aunt called hers. She thought of her aunt's hands, ringed and manicured, resting on the mahogany table the day the will was read. She thought of her cousins' voices, bright and certain, dividing yachts like party favors. She thought, too, of her grandmother's hands, spotted, thin-veined, closing over Clara's own in the last winter of her life, saying nothing about any of this, though surely she had known. Surely she had carried it the way she carried everything, quietly, and let the truth wait for someone patient enough to find it. Clara had not set out to unmake her family's fortune. She had set out to fix a boat. She folded the copies into the same worn envelope she had been keeping since the harbor authority, and for the first time since she'd started pulling this thread, she let herself wonder, not whether the discovery was real, she no longer doubted that, but whether she was the kind of person who could stand in that same mahogany room and say it aloud, knowing exactly whose names would come apart when she did. She got in the truck. She did not start the engine right away. The name had come from the Historical Society archivist, mentioned almost as an aside, a man who had spent 30 years walking the harbor bottom with a transit and rod before the town digitized its records, who still, people said, kept his old field books in a shed behind his house on Poplar Street. She had written to him first, formally, the way her grandmother had taught her to write to strangers whose help she needed. He had answered within the week, in pencil, agreeing to look at what she had. He was 81, built low and weathered like a piling, and he did not invite her inside so much as clear a space for her at a workbench crowded with rusted survey stakes. He did not ask why she wanted to know. He unrolled her copy of the 1962 survey beside a county plat map yellowed at its folds, set a magnifying lupe over both, and was quiet for a long time, in a way that reminded her, uncomfortably, of the way she had waited beside hospital beds for test results. "This bearing," he said finally, tapping a line with a blunt finger. "This is the same monument they used for the Harbor Commission survey in '58. I set stones like that myself. Later, further up the shore. Whoever drew this knew exactly what they were doing." He walked her through it the way he must have once walked clients through disputes over fence lines and rights of way, patiently, without drama, translating the survey's spare notations into plain distances and directions. "The original boundary," he said, tracing it with a pencil that never quite touched the paper, did not stop at the seawall the family had always treated as the edge of their property. It continued, unbroken, beneath what was now the mansion's granite foundation. It ran under the boathouse where she was standing right now. It crossed beneath both docks and curved out into the harbor itself, taking in the swinging moorings where 2 yachts sat at anchor, bearing her cousins' names in gold leaf. "Whoever subdivided this later," he said, setting the pencil down, "either didn't have this survey in front of them, or didn't want to." He did not ask her what she intended to do with what he'd told her. He simply initialed the margin of her copy, the way he must have initialed 1,000 documents in his working life, and told her, almost gently, that a boundary like that did not care how long a family had ignored it. Clara drove back along the shore road in the last gray light, past the mansion's lit windows, past the docks, past the yacht hulls rocking gently at moorings that sat, she now understood with a kind of quiet vertigo, on water that had never stopped being her grandmother's. That night she did not sleep so much as sit inside the dark, the survey and the letter spread on the workbench beside the skiff's half-sanded hull, the brass tube standing upright like a small sentinel between them. She read the letter again by the light of a single clamp lamp, slower this time, not for facts but for tone. There was no fury in it. Her grandmother had not written the words of a woman preparing to punish anyone. She had written like someone leaving instructions for a tide table, patient, exact, certain the water would do what water always did whether or not anyone was watching. She thought of the last week, the hospital bed set up in the good parlor, because her grandmother had refused to die anywhere she couldn't see the harbor, the papery hand finding hers and saying, "The skiff still knows how to float, if someone's patient with her." She had thought, at the time, it was only about the boat. It occurred to her now, sitting in the boathouse with the rain starting again on the tin roof, that she could drive straight to the mansion. She could set the survey on the kitchen table in front of the aunt who had called this building a nuisance the tide would take care of, and watch the color leave that composed, expensive face. She let herself imagine it for perhaps 30 seconds, no longer, and did not like how it fit in her chest, tight and hot, more like the aunt's own posture than her own. Her grandmother had not hidden a weapon under that hull. She had hidden a fact, and left it to be found by whoever was patient enough to strip a rotted keel down to its ribs. That, Clara understood, was the whole of the instruction, not use this against them, but let it be true, and let true things surface in their own time, the way the water does. She would not go to the family with it. Anger delivered directly only asked to be met with anger, and the aunt had a lawyer of her own who charged by the 6-minute increment and had never lost an argument he could delay long enough to exhaust. What she had was not an accusation. It was a legal fact sitting quietly in a drawer, waiting for someone with standing and patience to confirm it properly, the same way she had waited 11 years for a woman's breathing to even out before she let herself close her eyes in the chair beside the bed. In the morning she called the office in town and asked, in a voice steadier than she felt, whether the man who had handled her grandmother's estate might have an hour to spare her. Not for family business, she said, for a boundary question. The office had not changed since the reading of the will. Same rain against the same tall windows, same smell of lemon oil and old paper, same brass lamp throwing its small circle of yellow light onto a desk too large for the man who sat behind it. He had aged in the month since, or perhaps she simply noticed it now, the way his hands trembled faintly as he reached for his glasses, the way he took longer to rise than he once had. He greeted her with the courtesy he had always shown her, the kind that cost him nothing and had therefore always seemed genuine. She laid the survey flat on his desk, then the letter beside it, then the deed she had copied from the registry, and did not speak while he looked. He read slowly, he always had. He turned the survey toward the lamp and studied the surveyor's stamp with a jeweler's patience, then set it down and picked up the letter, reading it twice, his lips moving faintly over certain words as though testing them for weight. When he finally looked up, he removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture she recognized from the day he had read her grandmother's will aloud to a room that had not wanted to hear the word. Boathouse. "May I keep these overnight?" he said. Not really a question. She said he could keep them as long as he needed. He did not need long. 3 days later he called her back, and this time he did not wait for her to sit before he spoke, which told her something before the words did. The subdivision in 1968 was never properly recorded against the original parcel, he said. The registry copy has your grandmother's signature and no one else's, dated later than the deeds it supposedly amended. I have cross-checked it against the Harbor Authority's survey history twice. I would not say this to you if I were not certain, Miss Whitfield. He paused, and something in his weathered face softened, not with pity but with something closer to respect. Your grandmother's title to the original parcel was never extinguished. Legally, it still stands, which means, as of this morning, so do you. He did not smile when he said it. He looked instead like a man setting down a weight he had carried without knowing its shape, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the rain filling the silence the way it always did in that room, patient, indifferent, and entirely on her side. The letter went out that same afternoon, on the firm's letterhead, requesting the presence of the surviving family at 10 o'clock the following Thursday to discuss, in the lawyer's carefully bloodless phrasing, a matter materially affecting the estate. She was asked to come as well. She wore the same gray coat she had worn to the first reading, not out of any sense of theater, but because it was the only coat she owned that still fit properly. And she found, standing outside the building in the same needling rain, that her hands were steadier than she expected them to be. The room had not changed, the same mahogany, the same brass lamps throwing their small circles of yellow light against the gloom, the same tall windows streaked with water running down in threads that caught and lost the light. What had changed was the seating. The aunt took the chair nearest the desk, as she always did, arranging her coat with the same brisk efficiency, and the cousins flanked her, checking their phones until the lawyer cleared his throat, a sound that in that room had always meant attention now. He did not draw it out. He was too old and too tired of that family's theater to indulge in suspense for its own sake. He read from the survey and the registry findings in plain, unhurried language, naming dates and parcel numbers, the way he might read a grocery list, and it took the aunt perhaps 40 seconds to understand what he was telling her. "That's absurd," she said, and there was a thinness in her voice that had not been there 11 years before. "That land has been in this family since 1962, as recorded," the lawyer said, "held solely and without interruption by your mother. The subdivision your father authorized in 1968 was never properly executed against her title. I am sorry. I have checked this 3 times. The younger cousin laughed, the same short, ugly laugh from the first reading, but it came out wrong this time, thin and searching for something to land on and finding nothing. The older one said nothing at all. He was looking at her, really looking, for the first time in 11 years. The way a man looks at a bridge he has just been told will not hold his weight. "So the boathouse," the aunt said slowly, as though tasting something bitter. and the water beneath our own. Is one and the same parcel, the lawyer said. Yes. The rain kept on outside, indifferent as ever, and inside that paneled room the silence that followed was so complete she could hear the small tick of the lamp's brass chain swaying where someone had brushed it. No one laughed now. No one had anything cutting left to say. Clara let the silence hold a moment longer than she needed to. It was not cruelty that kept her quiet. It was the simple fact that she had never, in her life, spoken from a position of power, and she wanted to be certain of her own voice before she used it. I'm not here to take the mansion, she said finally. The aunt's head came up sharply, as though she had misheard. I don't want the yachts moved. I don't want anyone off the docks. Clara folded her hands on the table, the same table where a folder full of Xerox deeds had once been slid toward her as an afterthought. I want a lease, fair market rate, reviewed every 5 years, for the water rights and the mooring access. You keep your house, you keep your view, you pay for what's actually mine to give. The lawyer, who had spent 3 decades watching this family take from each other, looked at her the way a man looks at weather finally breaking after a long drought. That is, he said carefully, considerably more generous than the law requires you to be. I know what the law requires, Clara said. I spent 11 years learning what people actually owe each other, which is a different arithmetic. The aunt's composure, so carefully maintained through 3 separate ruinations of her own certainty, did something then that none of them had seen in the 11 years Clara had known her. It did not shatter. It simply gave way, the way old caulking gives way, quietly, along a seam that has been under strain far longer than anyone admitted. Your grandmother, the aunt said, and her voice had lost its edge entirely, used to stand at that boathouse window every morning with her coffee. Before she got sick, I used to think she was looking at the boats. She stopped, looked at her hands. She was looking at the waterline. I didn't understand what that meant until just now. No one corrected her. No one needed to. The younger cousin was staring at the table's grain as though it might rearrange itself into an answer. The older one had not moved his eyes from Clara since the lawyer's 3rd confirmation, and there was something in his expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite shame, but occupied the narrow country between them. The lease will be drawn up properly, the lawyer said, already reaching for a fresh legal pad, the old habit of decades still steady in his hands despite everything. Fair value, independently assessed. I'll have the Harbor Authority confirm the boundary lines against the 1962 survey, so there's no ambiguity going forward. There won't be, Clara said. I've read that map more times than anyone in this room. Outside, the rain had thinned to something almost gentle, the kind that made no claim on the window glass at all, only softened it. By September, the boathouse smelled of sawdust and linseed oil instead of rot and low tide, and the sound that filled it was no longer dripping but the patient rasp of a plane against new wood. She had rebuilt the loft first, then the workbench, then, slowly, the reputation of the place. A hand-painted sign by the door reading nothing grander than Whitfield Boat Works, the letters plain, unhurried, the way she did everything now. The skiff floated at the dock outside, hull gleaming with 3 coats of varnish she had rubbed out by hand on evenings when the light lasted long enough. Tourists sometimes stopped to admire it, not knowing what it carried beneath its restored planking, not knowing that the keel they photographed had once hidden a truth heavy enough to move a fortune. She never told them. Some things belonged only to the water and to her. The first students came in October. A retired school teacher who wanted to learn to caulk a seam properly before he died. A boy of 14 whose father had left him nothing but a rowboat and a bad temper. She taught them the way her grandfather had taught her, hands over hands, patience mistaken for magic until you understood it was only attention, sustained. In the evenings, after the shop had emptied and the harbor had gone the color of pewter, she would sit at the small desk by the window, the same window her grandmother had once watched from, and take out the letter, its brass tube retired now to a shelf above the desk, like a relic that had finished its work. She did not need to read it anymore. She had long since memorized every line, the particular slant of the handwriting when it reached the word. Deed. The small tremor near the signature that betrayed how tired the hand had been, and how determined regardless. But she read it anyway, most nights, the way some people said a name aloud just to keep it in the room. The water always finds its way home. The letter ended. So will you. Outside, the tide was coming in, the way it always had, the way it always would, indifferent to lawyers and lawns and mahogany offices, patient in a manner no inheritance could rival. It slid beneath the docks her family had built on land they never owned, beneath the moorings, beneath the boathouse itself, touching all of it equally, asking nothing, keeping no ledger but its own. Clara folded the letter along its old creases and set it back on the shelf, beside the tube, beside the survey, beside 11 years of patience finally accounted for. Then she turned off the lamp and let the harbor keep its watch a while longer, the way it always had, long before her, and long after she, too, would only be a name someone spoke gently, at a window, over coffee, remembering.